On a wooded ridge in central Massachusetts, there lives a boulder named Drew. He's been there for 12,000 years, give or take a millennium or two, having migrated down with the last glacier. His home seems to have been picked very carefully because he sits on a narrow peninsula of ledge that drops sharply away on three sides. A foot or two either way would send him rolling down into a valley, seriously ruining his magnificent view in all directions. As it is, Drew's view has been compromised by oak and maple trees that have found his company so amenable they've taken up residence in great profusion in his neighborhood. He doesn't seem to mind, probably because the trees allow a delightful mixture of sun in the cold winter and shade in the hot summer. That, coupled with the fact that they break up even gentle breezes with their sturdy trunks, makes his home a delightful place even without the far-seeing vistas. I came to know Drew some years ago. Having found the neighborhood so pleasing, I moved in. My wife, Cynthia, and I built a small cabin right next door. We don't really live there. The building codes and zoning laws of Massachusetts preclude living without electricity and plumbing, modern amenities that we thought would be insulting to our new neighbors and downright anachronistic to us. So we visit there from time to time, enjoying the peace and quiet of a summer's afternoon, an autumn's rainstorm, a winter's soft snowfall, or a spring's glorious awakening. Drew doesn't say much, so we find him to be a very peaceful neighbor. The trees whisper a lot, especially at night, but we don't mind that kind of noise. From time to time we see animals who live close by. The Reginald Fox family, Mr. and Mrs., along with either son, cousin, or uncle, we're not sure which, come by to share the blueberries. Raccoons have been known to stop by in the late afternoon for a flute concert. Squirrels, much too busy for such a quiet neighborhood, scold us all for not being industrious enough. Many birds, from chickadees to ruffed grouse and turkeys, come and go. The occasional deer wanders by, probably intent on the local watering hole, but no doubt also speculating on the coming of age of the 2 apple trees we brought with us when we moved in. One night we were treated to the sights and sounds of 2 amorous fisher cats, and on a memorable fog-shrouded evening had an encounter with a transient moose. It's a peaceful place, and although we don't live in the cabin full-time, we call it home. It was only after we moved in, however, that we got to know Drew. Because his east side is ground very flat, it is obvious he slid down from the north, scraping himself smooth in the process, then rolled over to stand on his pedestal only when the ice melted. I formed the habit of referring to him as a glacial erratic, a term I thought very factual, as well as a bit poetic. It seemed to hint of faraway places, long time spans, and mysterious forces of ice and wind. But while reading a book about geology, I one day discovered Drew might not be an erratic after all. A glacial erratic only earns its name if it is composed of different rock than what it rests on. If Drew and his pedestal were from the same family, he probably didn't come from very far away and would be called technically a transported boulder, which doesn't sound nearly as romantic and mysterious as glacial erratic. Clearly, I had a problem with what to call Drew. I wanted a romantic, mysterious category for him, but all I had was a flat, technical one. So, because we live in an information age and are constantly told we can't do anything without consulting experts, I decided to consult an expert about Drew. Bob Coyle is a friend, bird watcher, close observer of nature, science teacher, and geologist. So Cynthia and I invited him to have lunch with us at our cabin. I played nurse to his doctor as we gave Drew a thorough physical examination. We learned where he probably came from, how much he weighed, and what might have happened to him on his trip down from the North Country. After lunch, we sat on our front porch awaiting the diagnosis: glacial erratic or transported boulder. For an absolutely incurable romantic like me, a lot seemed to ride on the verdict, but Bob proved equal to the task, quite properly stretching out the suspense to fit the seriousness of the occasion. He suggested a third possibility: ancient Druids in New England. Druids put it there? That's it. Tell me no more. And so our glacial erratic or transported boulder became Drew, and remains so to this day. Although we were being slightly, but only slightly facetious, there is something about Drew that seems to exude ancient and mysteriously religious stirrings. Standing next to him on the dark night of the winter solstice, the primary feeling I have is of age. Not my own, mind you, or even Drew's. It's more that we are both enveloped by something a lot more ancient than either of us. Something that seems to view us both as mere children. Maybe it's an ancient presence in a particular spot of ground. Maybe even the cosmos itself. I really don't know. But when wild geese call from the darkness above, I almost expect small, bearded men to peer at me from deep within the surrounding shadows, while moss clings and drips from mysterious beings arising out of the nearby pond. It's a primitive feeling, very ancient, very mysterious, very pagan, and very basic. It seems to be truth, stripped bare of its trappings and revealed to be much larger than thoughts and feelings that usually concern our days and nights. I quickly am forced to drop the opinion that the world was made only for us humans. Drew, you see, is old enough, but not too old. I am, of course, referring to his stay in our neighborhood, not his actual age. I can't really conceive of millions of years, but 10 to 12,000 is a good number. It's large enough to inspire holy awe, but not so large as to become mere fact. It's just conceivable, in other words, but it inhabits the outer edges of conceivability. I am a clergyman, used to dealing with biblical epics. As a Christian, I think of times relative to the birth of Christ, so I find it somewhat mystical to imagine that on the first Christmas Eve, Drew had already lived on this spot of ground for about 10,000 years. Let's go back even further. In Sunday school, we learned about those ancient and bigger-than-life patriarchs of Judaism, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. During the time those stories are reported to have taken place, Drew had been in place for 6,000 to 8,000 years. I find myself getting lost in the idea of him sitting right here on this very spot of ground, surrounded by the ancestors of these very trees, while Abraham was supposedly making his trip from Ur of the Chaldees to Canaan. But there's more. Shortly after Drew settled in, while the land all around was still bare rock with only some moss and grasses beginning to grow up to spoil his magnificent view, great woolly mammoths and giant beavers, herds of grass-eating animals and their predators, such as saber-toothed cats, began to live nearby. They, in time, attracted Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, the first humans Drew had ever met, the folks we used to call cavemen when we were kids. Their ancestors had spent generations camping around the shores of Lake Baikal in Siberia, developing the spirituality that would many years later frighten Cotton Mather and the New England Puritans half out of their wits. It was a very powerful earth-based religion, recognizing spirits and gods in trees and mountains, and almost certainly based on the reality of some of the same feelings that impress me so much on the dark night of the solstice. Perhaps the idea of ancient Druids in New England isn't so very far from the truth. Drew would have presided over a good meeting place. The view was open, the feelings ancient and mystical. God knows I've been tempted to dance around him a few moonlit nights. Who knows?
Sing into the world, it's time we let the Spirit come in. Let Him come on in, I'm singing to the world. Everybody's caught in a spin. Look at where we've been running around, year after year, blinded with pride, blinded with fear. But it's daybreak, if you wanna believe it can be daybreak. It's no time to grieve, said it's daybreak. If you'll only believe and let it shine, 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 all around the world, all around the world. Singing to the world, what's the point in putting it down? There's so much love to share, I'm singing to the world. Don't you see it all comes around? The feeling's everywhere, we've been closing our eyes, day after day, covered in clouds, losing our way. But it's daybreak, if you wanna believe it can be daybreak. It's no time to grieve, said it's daybreak. If you'll only believe and let it shine, 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 all around the world, all around the world. It's daybreak, if you wanna believe it can be daybreak. It's no time to grieve, said it's daybreak. If you'll only believe and let it shine, 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 all around the world, all around the world, all around the world, all around the world, around the world.
12 years ago, the day I crossed the Continental Divide on a bicycle was also the first day I ever rode more than 100 miles. Bikers call such an effort a century. I had come close a few times in training, doing back-to-back 98-mile days just to see how it felt, but I wanted to save my first century for the trip itself. On that memorable day, I started out in a light rain. Hours later, and some 3,000 feet higher, rain had turned into sleet, then snow. Because I didn't have any gloves, I wore a pair of socks for mittens to keep my hands from going numb. Believe me when I say that operating an 18-speed bicycle while wearing a pair of socks on your hands is an adventure. But all was forgotten when I reached the top of the divide some 8,000 feet up. All the weather had piled up on the western side of the mountains. Behind me was what looked like winter. Before me was sun-washed spring. I pushed off and coasted some 25 miles downhill, hardly touching the pedals. Now that's contrast. The southeast coast, however, is a different story. Coming from hilly New England, I never understood the articles in Bicycling magazine about the importance of hill training for building strength. They used to give how-to tips that began, first, find a hill. Where I lived, that was never a very difficult thing to do. When we went house shopping last year, one of my goals was to find a home I didn't have to climb uphill to reach at the end of a ride. For 20 years, I dreaded my own heartbreak hill, the long climb that was on my mind every time I went on a ride or a distance run. I knew I would have to face it before I could get back home. Sometimes that hill could reach out 50 miles with its own brand of gloom. But hills mean vistas, far-seeing places, and that's what riding or hiking is all about. When you break out of the familiar and suddenly see something new before you, when you see the world in its entirety, all the pieces fitting together into a whole, the trip is worthwhile. That's why people climb mountains, I suppose. A real mountaintop experience puts life in perspective. I first saw Grand Canyon from the saddle of a bicycle. For hours riding toward it, I was conscious of a great, brooding space. I knew I would discover something, but I didn't know what. Then, there it was. It literally took my breath away. For the hour or two that I sat or stood or walked on the rim, I just knew my life was not nearly as complicated as I usually imagine it to be. Compared to such a complex, mysterious vista, all is vanity, as the Hebrew writer so aptly put it. But vistas are not always seen with the eye. Sometimes you experience a vista in your soul. I'm talking about those life-changing aha moments, when something new breaks into your consciousness and you understand truth in a different way. Your day-to-day life has until now consisted of laboring up a long, steep psychological and emotional path without any real understanding. Without knowing it, you have been preparing, gathering impressions and ideas. Then, in one moment of time, it happens. 100 different insights and experiences come together, and you see your vista. It changes your life. You will never be quite the same again.
There's a lighthouse on a hillside that overlooks life's sea. And when I'm tossed and turned, it sends out a light that I might see. And the light that shines in darkness now will safely lead us all. If it wasn't for the lighthouse, then my ship would sail no more. Everybody that lives around us says, tear that old lighthouse down. You see, the big ships don't sail this way anymore. There's no use in it standing round. But then my mind goes back to that stormy night when just in time I saw the light. Yes, the light from that old lighthouse that's still standing up there on the hill. And I thank God for the lighthouse. I owe my life to Him, for Jesus is the lighthouse, and from the rocks of sin He has shone a light around me, that I could clearly see. If it wasn't for the lighthouse, where would this ship be? And I thank God for the lighthouse. I owe my life to Him, for Jesus is the lighthouse, and from the rocks of sin He has shone a light around me, that I could clearly see. If it wasn't for the lighthouse, where would this ship be?
I graduated from the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. At the time, I thought I was going to be a full-time professional musician, and for a while, I was. But in Rochester, I came under the influence of some men who roamed the woods and fields that, before the building boom of the 70s, made up the countryside outside the city. Ben and Ellison, Ken and the Jolly Green Giant, Finley and Cap all took over where my father had begun, teaching me to hunt, fish, and play the fiddle. My way of coping with the city for 5 weekdays was to have someone drop me off in the woods for the weekend. Equipped only with a hunting knife, knapsack, fishing rod, or rifle, I would live off the land for a few days. If I didn't get anything to eat, I went hungry. As a result, I still have fond memories of roast woodchuck for breakfast, cooked slowly over an open fire with blueberries for dessert. I seem to have conveniently forgotten the days I went without. Later, when I took up residence in Massachusetts at the ripe old age of 25 or so, I naturally discovered Courser. He was in his late 60s then. His hunting partner had just died, a loss any real sportsman will understand, so I gravitated into the vacuum. Courser changed me. Like every kid in his early 20s, I measured the success of a hunting or fishing trip by how much game I brought home, since in my early hunting experience, not shooting something meant going hungry. In those days, too, our young family had a tradition that the Thanksgiving table could only hold food I shot, caught, or raised. Vegetables from the garden were flanked by a pheasant, a grouse or two, a brace of woodcock on the side, perhaps enhanced by a squirrel or rabbit. The tradition lasted only until the kids got old enough to ask why we couldn't eat turkey like everyone else. It broke my heart, and to this day, Thanksgiving is not the same. So I was a slash-and-burn hunter. General Sherman himself could have learned something from me. When Courser and I went into the woods, I was accompanied by my favorite dog, Coco, Courser's 2 short-haired pointers, a shotgun, and an attitude. The only advantage the wildlife enjoyed was that Courser didn't want to kill anything, and I couldn't. Oh, the spirit was willing, but I was a lousy shot. My more liberal consciousness-raised friends used to say to me, "How can you shoot those poor, innocent birds?" My reply was always the same: I don't know. How? I try and can't hit a thing. When all 3 dogs went on point, and a ruffed grouse or pat New Englandese for partridge, looking at least 3 feet long, came boiling out of a cover headed for daylight. I sometimes got 3 shots off into the trees and sky before Courser could yell, "There goes a magnificent specimen of Bonassa umbellus," or some such Latin equivalent. He would then apologize to the dogs for not doing his part, and off we would go again. Courser's road, you see, had been different from mine. He was old enough to remember the glory years of hunting after the war. World War II had kept hunters overseas long enough for farms to grow into bird heaven, brush piles, overgrown fields, scrub woods, perfect habitat for upland game, had experienced an explosion of birds. So he had long since outgrown his need to hunt for the table. He was in it now for the dogs and the experience. I never saw him kill a trout. They were always returned to the stream. And on the occasions he did bring down a pat for dinner, I always saw a look in his eye that revealed his wish to return the bird back to the cover so he could hunt it again. Lee Wolf once said, "A game fish is too valuable to be caught only once." That's how Courser felt. He enjoyed the act of hunting and the act of fishing. And he could easily be made to pontificate against those who spoiled the essence of the sport. But to understand that, you have to understand a little about the fishing hierarchy as defined by purist, old-school trout fishermen. At the top of the pecking order are those who fly fish. When you catch a trout on a dry fly, you are participating in quite a different experience from those who, horrors, throw gaudy metal plugs or even worse, bait at lesser fish. So there are dry fly fishermen followed somewhat down the scale by fishermen who fish wet with nymphs and streamers below the surface. Then there are those who spin fish with a light line. Then there's nothing for a long way until you reach the bass boat crankbait bass casting fraternity. After that, there's nothing at all unless you're a kid with a cane pole who doesn't know any better. That's why while gardening peacefully one evening long ago, I heard a screech of brakes, a squealing of tires, and a voice sounding forth across the New England common, "Willis, was that a worm I saw you pick up out of that compost heap?" One of my favorite memories of Courser, though, was the night we were fishing from his canoe way up and gone back in the boondocks right at twilight. Neither of us had said a word for what seemed like hours, and I was entranced by the sight of a woodcock sitting on a whacking big hemlock stump with the sun setting right behind him. It was beautiful, quiet, and relaxing. Then we were attacked by the huts. Now, to understand what huts are, you have to know that canoe racing was just getting big in those parts. Two paddlers would race upstream or across lakes, and whenever the man in the stern yelled, "Hut!" they would flip their paddles to the other side of the canoe and keep moving. Courser had a nice float going, and I was idly watching the woodcock when we heard, "Hut!" Splash, splash, splash. "Hut!" Splash, 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 and around the bend came a racing canoe headed right for us. I was in the bow, facing away from Courser, so I didn't see his face when the lead paddler yelled, "Excuse me, sir, we're coming through." Courser yanked his line out of the water, getting it tangled in a tree behind him, and we watched the racing canoe ram the beaver dam upriver from us, then back off and ram it again. When it became obvious they weren't going to get over or through it, they turned around right in front of us and headed back downriver. I didn't dare turn around and look at Courser. I just sat there waiting. Courser didn't say a word. I heard him reel in his line and pick up his paddle. I did the same. The silence grew profound. We headed downstream. I still didn't dare say a word. After about 10 minutes, Courser said very quietly, "Hut." I almost fell out of the boat.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home. A band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home.
And singing,
swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Michael,
if you get there before I do,
hallelujah,
coming for to carry me home.
Michael, row the boat ashore.
Coming there too, coming for to carry me home.
The river Jordan is chilly and cold. Hallelujah, chills the body but not the soul. Hallelujah, Michael, row the boat ashore. Hallelujah, Michael, row the boat ashore. Hallelujah. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home.
Swing low, sweet
Swing low, sweet
coming for to carry
chariot,
me home.
coming for to carry me
Swing low,
home.
sweet
Swing low,
chariot,
sweet
coming for to carry
chariot,
me
coming for to
home.
carry me home.
Coming for to carry me
Coming for to carry me
home.
Some of us are planners. Some are doers. I'm more of a planner. I have boundless energy as long as I'm looking at maps and dreaming by a warm fire in December. I dream big dreams. I think I can accomplish anything I envision. Come the heat of the summer and the sweat of the journey, and I'm not quite so positive. I began to learn that lesson in humility 15 years ago, the day of the great Booth Bay Revival in Maine. In case you've never read about that event in the newspapers or studied it in history class, I'd better fill you in. One of the things I used to do quite often when I was a fundamentalist was participate in what they call, down south at any rate, revivals. A local church would ask me to come for a series of meetings, sometimes a few days, sometimes a week, lead services every night, meet with small groups during the day, sing a little, preach a lot, teach some Bible studies, and try to lead people into a deeper spiritual life. By the time of the Great Booth Bay Revival, I had recorded and sold a few thousand copies of 2 gospel music albums and led perhaps 200 or 300 revivals or special meetings. Moody Bible Institute, that bastion of Midwestern fundamentalism, had even flown a man out from Chicago to talk to me about applying for their position of music director. Of course, when he saw my beard, he may have figured I had been saved, but was a radical, so that didn't pan out. But I was still pretty confident. So when I got the call from an enthusiastic pastor in Booth Bay to come and revitalize the spiritual condition of the Maine seacoast, I was ready. The plan was to go up there, or rather down to Maine, as we New Englanders put it, do a concert on Wednesday, and then lead services each night, culminating on Sunday evening with a real revival service featuring foot-stamping music and an altar call, just like Billy Graham. About 2 months before the event, the pastor called to ask if I could send some record albums to the local country music radio station. They had promised airtime each day during their Song of Inspiration segment. I was only too happy to oblige. A few weeks later, I was asked to supply some posters. The church was going to blanket the town in a technique they called saturation evangelism. You want posters? I got them. A week before the event, the local newspaper asked for some 8x10 glossies. Sure, fire off the photos. The morning of the first meeting, I loaded up my motorhome with sound equipment, instruments, records, and tapes. I sallied forth to change the course of religious life in America. By the time I hit Booth Bay, I was seeing my face on posters plastered to every tree and telephone pole in the area. With exquisite timing, as I pulled into the church parking lot, I found the right station on the AM dial just as they were playing the last verse of me singing "In the Garden." The pastor met me and helped me set up my equipment and do a sound check. Then it was off to his house for dinner. After dinner, we shared some pretty fervent prayer in his office and then headed into the sanctuary, where I walked in the back door promptly at 7:30 to meet the congregation that was to occupy my activities for the next 5 days. The total crowd consisted of the pastor and his family, my wife and me, the organist, 5 members of the Ladies' Benevolent Society who were meeting that night anyway and decided to stay for the service, and a custodian who spent most of the hour looking at his watch. And the first hymn of the evening, sung falteringly, if not ironically, by the assembled multitude, was "Faith is the victory that overcomes the world." Now, to be fair, the congregations did get bigger. And by Sunday, the church was pretty much filled. They were wonderful people, and I really enjoyed my stay with them. But my first thought as I entered the sanctuary on that Wednesday night was, "Pride goeth before defeat, and a haughty spirit before a fall." Since then, at the beginning of every endeavor, especially those bike riding days when I'm tempted to think I can accomplish anything beyond what I know my ability to be, I have quietly said, "Remember the great Booth Bay revival." Remember to have realistic expectations, to prepare for the worst, to hope for the best. Be humble, seek justice, and walk quietly with your God. It keeps me from getting overconfident.
I come to the garden alone, while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses, and He walks with me, and He talks with me, and He tells me I am His own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. He speaks, and the sound of His voice is so sweet, the birds hush their singing, and the melody that He gives to me within my heart is ringing, and He walks with me, and He talks with me, and He tells me I am His own, and the joy we
as we tarry there, none other has ever known.
Just before Christmas in 1966, I was in the middle of my junior year in college, president of my fraternity, director of my church choir, inheritor of my first automobile, and laborer at my first real job. The world lay at my feet and looked pretty good. The Vietnam War, the draft, career, and possibly marriage were still at least a year away, and that was an eternity to a 20-year-old kid. My folks had been transferred to Australia for a year. My sister lived in Detroit, and I was going to school in Rochester, New York. For a close-knit family who had always made church the center of the holidays, we were spread far and wide around the world for the first time. I suppose I should have been feeling a bit down and depressed, but truthfully, I was a kid with his first car, first taste of responsibility, some spending money. Depressed? A little, but... Are you going to be okay, Jim? Don't worry, Mom. Can you come to Detroit in time for Christmas Eve? I'll be there, sis. Party time. But it didn't work that way. All the rest of the kids in the dorm were packing up and going home. Most of them were jealous of a guy on his own. It was, after all, the height of the 60s when teenagers thought they were coming of age. Eventually, depression did settle in. Pretty soon I was the only one left in my dorm room, and it was very, very quiet. Where does a 20-year-old guy go for a good time? Then, as now, a kid goes to the mall, bustling with busy people and lots of music. In those days, they still sandwiched a few joy to the worlds between the rocking around the Christmas trees. I sat down, ate a hamburger, and watched the crowds. It was then I spotted a harried, middle-aged woman. Really old to a 20-year-old. Remember, those were the days when he didn't trust anyone over 30. She had 3 kids hanging on to her, and they were pulling her in at least 6 directions. Both her hands were full of packages, and she was trying to push a stroller and manage everything at once. What caught my eye was her expression. She was as flustered as anyone I had ever seen. There were obviously troubles brewing, probably because she was behind schedule and buying for a small army. Nowadays, we would say she was one step away from burnout. She was trying hard not to yell at the kids, but something was soon going to explode. Then it happened. A man, obviously on his lunch hour and expected back at the office, collided with her as she looked one way at one kid and grabbed another going the opposite way. Down she went, packages flying in all directions and kids on top of her. The businessman swore and kept going. He was, after all, important and in a hurry. She just sat there and cried. Lots of tears. And no one stopped. I left my lunch and strode over, picking up her presents on the way. May I carry these for you? She looked worried. I was, after all, an unknown kid holding her presents. Who knows what I might have done? But there must have been something in my eye, something that reassured her. Thank you, she said. She really seemed to mean it. Are you parked nearby? Well, thanks, but I can manage. I'm sure you're busy. I've got until Thursday, I said with a grin. She trusted me. A present in itself, although I'm sure she never knew about the gift I received. She had given me the seeds of a flower that would bloom over the years, a blossom called serendipity. I gave one small package to each kid and said, "Let's go." I carried the rest and she pushed the stroller. She was parked about 3 blocks away, and when we got to the car, she was a little nervous. Now what would happen? I helped her get everything into the trunk and everyone into their respective car seats and then turned to go. "Wait a minute," she said, and held out her hand with some money in it. I must admit, I was tempted. I had a job, but always appreciated $1. But it wasn't the time. "Merry Christmas," I said. "Buy something for the kids." She wept again. She just stood there and believed in the goodness of the world once more and wept. "You've made my Christmas," she said, and got into the car to drive into whatever future God had for her. I hadn't made her Christmas. She had made mine. She showed me that it's a lot more fun to give than to receive. Only much later would I learn it's also a lot easier. But at that moment, she had let me feel a tiny bit of what God must have felt when the first Christmas gift was given. I walked back into the mall, bought another hamburger, and sat humming along with the music. Joy to the world never sounded so good.
It's funny how things work out, even though you said that's the way it would be. I don't really understand at all, and I don't expect you'll listen to me. You see, I hear about you talking, they tell me you're working, but Lord, sometimes you seem so far away. So I wrote down this song. I know it can't be wrong to tell you just how I feel today. A world of darkness outside my window pane, and I never expected, I never dared hope that things would never be the same again. And then right before me, right inside me, I found the love I always thought was there. And the light came on, the love began, and it was Christmas everywhere. Lord, I thank you for Christmas, I thank you for the love of this very, very special day. And I want you to know, I need you to know, I'll play my part in this special way. From now on I'll love your work, I'll love your people, and I'll do the things that I must do to glorify Jesus with my heart and my soul, so he can give the glory to you.
Sometimes bad moments can lead to great memories. Serendipity can strike even in a moment of horror. I well remember a wedding I officiated at the Cathedral of the Pines, a beautiful outdoor cathedral in New Hampshire. It's a spectacular setting. As you sit in the congregation, you see a magnificent fieldstone altar made of stones gathered from every state in the Union. Beyond it stands the granite summit of Mount Monadnock rising up from a beautiful valley. The bride and groom had worked hard to ensure everything would be absolutely perfect. Dresses and tuxes, organist, soloist, the service itself, even the weather were right out of some bridal magazine's conception of ideal. When the processional went off without a hitch, I thought we were home free. Getting folks to the altar is sometimes the tricky part. Once I have everyone in place, I can cover anything that might go wrong. But not that time. When asked the formal question, "Who presents this woman to be married to this man?" We don't give brides away anymore. The bride's father replied in a confident voice, "Her mother and I do." He then kissed his daughter, placed her hand in the hand of his soon-to-be son-in-law, turned to take the 3 steps needed to place himself at his wife's side, stepped on his daughter's train, and pulled the wedding veil right off her head. Even that we managed to survive with only momentary confusion. With help from the maid of honor, the veil was put back in place. What came next was harder. The groom, obviously shaken by what had just transpired, was not yet fully recovered when asked to repeat his vows, and the ritual went something like this. Minister: I, John Doe. Groom: I, John Doe. Minister: take you, Mary Smith. Groom: take you, Mary Smith. Minister: to be my lawfully wedded wife. Groom: to be my awfully wedded wife. There followed a pregnant silence, while I madly cast about for a way to salvage these very literal and sacred vows, hoping against hope no one in the congregation had heard what he had just said. Unfortunately, the sound system was working perfectly, a fact that became apparent as soon as someone in the third row couldn't hold back the snicker everyone else had thus far managed to suppress. The wind blowing through the pines of the beautiful cathedral did its best to cover the coughs and wheezes of a congregation doing its best to hold back tears of laughter during the sacred moment, and the bride's face turned white as her gown. The groom looked hopelessly at me. He had absolutely no idea at all what had just transpired. At such moments, time tends to move in slow motion. It didn't help a bit that after I had managed to forge ahead long enough to finish the vows, the wind came up just as the couple stepped forward to light their unity candle, while the soloist sang a beautiful version of the wedding song. It usually is the highlight of the service. Bride and groom together pick up individual candles that burn on each side of the altar and light a central candle, signifying that the two shall become one. Except the wind blowing up from the valley extinguished the unity candle as soon as they lit it. The horrified bride thought their marriage was doomed. The candle, after all, is a powerful symbol of marriage. But, as I had assured them, it was only a symbol, not the reality. So even that mishap we managed to overcome. What does all this have to do with serendipity? Just this. Now, more than a decade of marriage and 2 kids later, the happily wedded couple agrees that their unforgettable wedding was one of the high points of their life. It is the endless subject of laughter at family reunions, and their older daughter never tires of saying, "Mommy, tell me about the time you and Daddy got married." More important, it taught them how to overcome obstacles that seem very large indeed at the time, but are, when seen through hindsight and the wisdom that comes with experience, not really so important.
us all the way in our life. There will be no strife with Jesus Christ and His kingdom which has come and made it possible for you and I to be one. I will make you queen of my home under the glory of our King. We'll raise our family in a castle full of love and trust the Lord in everything. Let us sing to the King, Hallelujah, Hallelujah. In times of trial when things are hard to see, will you stand by me with love? It can heal the pain, so let it rain on the roof of my soul. There is no hole that love can't fill. So let us climb the hill together. Let us climb the hill together. Let us climb the hill together. Let us climb the hill together.
When I experience anger, it almost always turns immediately into depression. People like me are probably not very well adjusted, at least in terms of Darwinian evolution and the principle of the survival of the fittest. We tend to internalize things. We punish ourselves rather than others. We are not among the fittest who survive by, even appropriately, directing our anger outward. Call it a psychological flaw, and it probably is, but unless I am totally innocent, which rarely happens, I can never be angry for long without getting depressed. I have found, however, through both personal and professional experience, that the depression I feel is a necessary, unpleasant stage that I must endure if I am ever to come out on the other side and begin a new phase of life. Please understand that I'm talking about run-of-the-mill garden variety depression brought on by things like sprained ankles far away from home, full-blown chemical depressions, which feel the same but last forever if not treated, are quite different beasts. That said, however, depression can be experienced in two ways. The first and most common feeling of depression is the down in the dumps, woe is me type, where we feel sorry for ourselves, get cranky, yell at the dog, go to bed, medicate ourselves with drink or ice cream, and just wait it out. Now, that is certainly not pleasant, but we all experience it. We even talk and sing about the blues, and the country music industry would soon go broke if we suddenly found a cure. Unless we get stuck, which can happen and is nothing to joke about, the cure is usually time and space to ourselves. But there is another valuable, constructive way to experience depression. Understanding that depression is a normal and appropriate part of the process that must follow the death of one stage and the beginning of another, it can be embraced, serving as an analytical tool for examining and envisioning a future different from the one to which we thought we were headed. Depression is a red light that will be followed by green as soon as we are ready to go on. To put it in childlike terms, depression is our friend. We just said that the supposed sickness of depression needs the medicine of time and personal space. But think about it carefully. Time and personal space are exactly the ingredients we need for personal introspection and self-evaluation. It can't be an accident. Depression must be telling us that its function is to lead us to another future, a new insight, a new beginning. Denial, bargaining, anger, and depression have been called the stages of grief, of death and dying. Maybe they should be called instead the stages of hope, of life and living. It cannot be a coincidence that the final stage is acceptance, the acceptance of a new future not yet understood. A new future not yet understood. That's the key, isn't it? But whatever kind of future can there be except one that is not yet understood? We can argue forever about the nature of time, whether it is circular, linear, or something else. But the fact remains that most of us experience it most of the time as past, present, and future. The future can be frightening just because it is unknown. That's why we do our best to insulate ourselves with insurance policies and retirement accounts. The story of the person who saves for a rainy day and then gets hit by a truck is reported with tragic irony and feels chilling because such a circumstance is often either our secret fear or a supposed justification for our own failure to prepare properly. So depression, when it is induced by a fear of what tomorrow may bring, can be just the tool we need to conquer our apprehensions and step into a new life stage of maturity with acceptance of our own mortality and fragility. Acceptance of a future not yet understood is called by religious folks faith. The writer of the biblical book of Hebrews called it the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It's what allows us to get up in the morning, having at least some trust that today, although still an unknown quantity, will be worth living. Without some kind of faith, we all would probably perish. Sad to say, some people do. After all, out there at the edge of faith lies the boundary of despair. Many who cross that boundary die, sometimes by their own hands, without hope. But faith, like every other living thing, can be fed and exercised, making it grow stronger, pushing the boundary farther out ahead.
I'll climb tomorrow's mountain. I'll swim yesterday's sea. I'll chase the clouds one by one, Lord, until you find me. Sometimes I feel so all alone.
us who died, that I might live.
I'll climb to Mars. I'll swim yesterday's sea. I'll chase the clouds one by one and search, Lord, until
you find me. Find me. Find me.
When I was young, a big group of us used to get together every Saturday morning to play baseball at a local park. Those were the days before adults supervised so much of kids' activities. I guess we must have had Little League and organized sports, but none of us ever participated. We used to choose our own teams, make up our own rules. The younger kids tried hard to belong, and the older ones practiced the skills they would someday need in middle management. There was a definite pecking order. And it used to seem terribly important to know where you stood. A place determined by how soon you were chosen and what position you were told to play. The person who was chosen last always played right field and never talked much. It was an exercise in playground dynamics, and only the ones who were in charge really enjoyed it. I never thought much about it. I just went along like everybody else. It was simply what you did on Saturday mornings back in our neighborhood. But one day, when I was in the 7th or 8th grade, a revolution took place. A guy named Mike, I've forgotten his last name, had recently moved into our neighborhood. Mike was an independent type, maybe even the world's first flower child. He was a good baseball player, soon moving to the top of the pecking order, but maybe because he was a new kid, or maybe, as I like to think, because he was a free thinker, he hadn't really become one of the playground CEOs who ran things. He was a maverick, apt to befriend the younger kids who played right field, that sort of thing. One day a rules dispute broke out. I seem to remember that somebody forgot to tag up on the rock that was third base and ran home before a fly ball was caught out in center field. Maybe it was something else. Memory can be tricky. All I know for sure is that since I wasn't directly involved, not really caring whether we won or lost, probably not even knowing what the score was, I just waited for the argument to be settled. I was standing next to Mike, who was also watching the whole thing transpire, and remember him looking over at me and saying, "This isn't much fun. Let's go home and do something else." Go home? You mean I can just do that? Don't I have to stay here and finish the game? Isn't that what everyone else does around here? We didn't say anything else. We didn't discuss what was about to become a playground revolution. Not really understanding it was a moment of destiny. We just picked up our gloves and left. "Where are you going?" was the response from our team captain. It was uttered in roughly the same tone of voice a prison guard might use if an inmate headed out the front gate. Alone, I probably would have either meekly returned to my position at second base or at least muttered some excuse about my mother calling me, but Mike didn't even hesitate. "This is a waste of time," he said for all to hear. "We're leaving." Such blasphemy, such world-shattering words of revolution had never before been declared in the remembered history of our little society. Someone had dared utter the truth most of us felt, but never dared speak out loud. once said, those words took on a life of their own. A mighty chorus began to swell from all over the diamond, even from right field. Tired of the few bossing the many, the voices of the downtrodden were heard. The powerful idea that Saturday mornings were supposed to be fun struggled forth into the light of day and burst into glorious flower. To this day, I can vividly see the faces of the playground bullies. Open disbelief. They simply couldn't understand with their minds what their intuition grasped in that moment of horror. Their world had been turned upside down. The masses had revolted and found strength in numbers, all because someone dared voice what all knew to be true but had found neither words nor will to articulate. Things didn't have to be the way they were. They could be changed. Who knows? Maybe the whole 60s revolution began right there on that Detroit playground on a Saturday morning in June.
I know where I'm going, and I know who's going with me. I know why there's music in the quiet summer morning. I found a wealth of gold, and silver have I plenty. I found a light to guide me when my way gets dark and stormy. Where are you going? Who will walk beside you when the night is gloomy? Where is the light to guide you? And where's your gold and your silver brightly shining? Who writes the music in the quiet summer morning? I'm going where he goes, and he'll be there beside me. The love for which he died is all I need to guide me. He is my gold and my silver brightly shine.